Alright, my demonstration for you today is on making a lidded pot. This particular pot that I plan to make is going to be used as a candy dish for a friend of mine. Making a lidded pot requires 2 pieces of clay. I have an idea of the size that this is going to be, and this is going to be a little bit larger than you might otherwise make. So I have a larger piece of clay here in front of me, already secured to a bat. This is about 3 pounds. So I know the size approximately that I'm going to make out of this particular piece. The other piece of clay that I have here in front of me, I'm going to set that aside. I've actually got the number 2 kind of carved into that ball of clay, and it's already setting on a bat. So that's about 2 pounds of clay, and I'm going to use that piece for the lid and the subsequent knob that I'm going to create with that piece. So I'm going to set that piece aside. And I'm going to get going with this particular piece. So as always, make sure that as you get going, you have your stool adjusted to the proper height. Make sure your wheel is turned on and spinning in the proper direction. Get my pedal going. And I like to have all of my tools that I'm going to be using for the process. With a lidded container of any kind, it's nice to have a caliper, and I'll show you how to use this in a little bit as we get to that point. I have my other tools here that are going to come into play as I'm working. A rib and a wood modeling tool, a needle tool, and of course my bucket of water and my sponge. So, as we begin, coating and centering, as always, make sure you use downward pressure. Make sure that that ball of clay is stuck to the bat. I'm sitting here, and again, my point of contact with my left palm is at approximately 7 o'clock. My right fingertips are coming in at approximately 1 o'clock. And I'm going to cone inward and upward using an even amount of pressure between my fingers and my palm. And as I center downward, using primarily my left hand and a little bit of water for lubrication as I center downward. This is a slow and steady process. I'm going to take that down about that far. And I'm going to cone that up one more time. The coning and centering process, as I've visited with you before, the coning and centering process is basically turning the clay inside out. I like to think of coning and centering as resembling a volcano. A volcano just is a crater that contains lava, and as you cone and center, that lava comes to the top, and as it reaches the top, it flows outward and back down again. So by turning the clay inside out with the coning and centering process, you're able to make that piece of clay that's in front of you more even, more uniform, more homogeneous. As a potter, a production potter, I've heard use the term homogeneous to try and make it all even. And as you cone and center, thinking about the shape, thinking about where you're going to go with that piece, because that's what helps you determine what type of shape the ball of clay on the bat in front of you needs to become. I introduced this that I'm going to make a candy dish, a lidded pot that will be used as a candy dish. A lidded pot, in reality, is just that, a lidded pot. Once you put something in it, then that determines what the pot is. If I make a lidded pot, it's just a pot with a lid. When I decide that I'm going to put candy in it, now it's a candy dish. If I decide to put dog treats in it, it's a canister for dog treats. If I put cookies in it, it's a cookie jar. So I've compressed that down, and now I have a fairly wide base, okay, because I'm making more of a bowl form to begin with. So now as I have that compressed downward, and I have a fairly wide base on this particular pot, This one's also going to be fairly deep, but as I do with good practice in an instructional manner, I make a small target, and that target is where my ring and middle finger of my left hand are going to go. I make a cradle with my right hand, and my ring finger and middle finger of my left hand begin in the center of that circle, of that target, and I push down slowly until I reach the desired depth. And I'm going to check that depth by stopping my wheel and use my needle tool, put it right in the middle, and still holding the needle tool, I push my finger against it, and that tells me right there that I have the desired thickness of about 1/2 inch. That's just a fingernail's worth of clay. So I've reached the desired depth. I go back to a slow to medium speed, put some water back in the middle, and now I start opening my ball of clay to set what's going to become the inside diameter of my candy dish. This is a slow and steady process. If you rush, I can pretty much guarantee you that your wall will be uneven. I still maintain a cradle with my hand, my right hand on the outside, my left finger's inside, and I'm slowly and gently pushing my left fingers outward towards my right hand, maintaining lubrication as I go. And you can see that the inside of my dish is getting wider and wider. And I'm going to begin, momentarily, I'm going to begin pulling upwards. What I like to do before I start pulling is, once I've set that inside diameter, I then like to go back and I'll use my right middle finger, and with a gentle downward pressure on the inside of the pot against the bottom, I'm going from the outside to the center and back and forth 2 or 3 times. This gentle pressure, this movement back and forth, is to make the bottom of my dish more uniform, but it also helps to compress the clay that I've been working to open up my pot. So now I've basically created the bottom. I've got that finished, and I'll take a moment and I'll clean that up. I don't want to leave water standing in the bottom of my dish for any length of time. That water may get absorbed by the clay, and it just makes your clay very soft. Okay? Now, as I begin with any pulling process, I like to make a little groove out here at the bottom. I'm going to make a groove down here with my right middle finger. And from that groove, the clay that's above my fingers is what I'm going to pull upwards. I again make a kind of a C with my left hand, forming with my thumb and my middle finger. The thumb is going to rest in between my ring and middle finger of my right hand on the outside of the clay. The middle finger of my left hand is going to be on the inside of the clay. And as I gently pull upwards, slowly and evenly, you can see that the clay wall is getting taller. It's getting thinner and taller as I move clay in an upward direction. Now, what's important to note is, as always, when I reach the rim, first off, I pulled slowly and evenly all the way up. Whatever space I had between my thumb and my middle finger, I maintained that space just as if it were a C-clamp, a mechanical device that's got thread screws. Okay? I maintain that space from bottom to top. I do not change the spacing of the finger and the thumb as I move up and down. When I reached the height of the rim, I continued just as if the wall were taller. I did not pinch my fingers together as I reached the rim. This allows me to lift right off and then come back and make a C, again with my thumb and index finger. You can use your middle finger, just make a C. Hold that wall gently and compress downward gently. Allow the clay to flow between your fingers. Alright, so now I have a more uniform wall, a much more uniform rim, and I've compressed the clay. Think of your rim as every time you're pulling it, you're stretching that clay, and you want to come back and compress it and make it a little stronger. I'm going to put a little water on, and I'm going to do one more pull. Moving slowly and evenly, lifting right off the rim. Go back and compress. And now I have the wall that is my candy dish. Clean up some loose stuff off of there. Clean up the outside. Now I can decide if there's a particular shape that I want this dish to be. And if I wanted to add a little bit of a belly or something to it. But what I'd like to do with this rim, because I've left the rim a little bit thicker, I know what kind of a lid I want to make. This is going to be a candy dish. So I don't want to do anything really complicated with the lid. But as I make that lid, it's got to be able to sit on there. And I want to be able to have the lid sit on there properly. So as I make this, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a different rib. Okay, I have a plastic rib in this case. Okay, and it's somewhat flexible. I talked in an earlier video about the green ones. The company that makes these ribs, they come in 4 different colors, and each color is indicative of a stiffness or flexibility, and this one has just the amount of flexibility that I like. So what I'm going to do with this now is I'm going to allow some curvature here. I'm going to use the rib, and I'm going to create that curvature. I start at the top, and I make sure that my rib is moist, is wet for lubrication. And slowly moving down towards the bottom of my pot. I move downward until the rib touches the bottom of the pot. Take another look at that, and that's got just enough nice shape to it. I can see what's happening on the outside, and I can take that rib and smooth out the inside a little bit more and give it a little bit more shape. And when I release, I do so slowly. Okay? So, I'm going to clean that up once more just with the sponge. Clean up that rim a little bit. And I now have a pretty nice inside of that pot. So that's a nice shape for the dish. I would take, because I'm basically done with this, I would take my wood modeling tool. Again, wood modeling tool, very versatile tool for a studio. Nice beveled edge to it, and the other end kind of looks like a thumb. I'm going to use that beveled edge, and I'm going to gently reach underneath. Over here at about 4 o'clock, I hold the tool firmly. I make sure that I'm braced. I don't want to have the clay get a hold of the tool and cause some unwanted damage to my pot. So I want to make sure I'm holding onto that tool tight. And here, this simple process
I get to clean away some of the excess clay down there at the bottom and give myself a nice beveled edge at the base of my pot.
And that leaves me less work to do later on when I might otherwise think about trimming. Now, I've apparently bumped that wall a little bit and set it off, gilt off its perfect roundness ever so slightly. So I want to make sure that I touch that back up, and now I have that back on center again. So there, in essence, I have my dish that is going to be my candy dish. Now I want to set that aside, and I'm going to clean off my back a little bit. And now I'm going to get into the process of making the lid for that pot. So what I want to do for this lid is I'm going to make a lid that has a flange on it. The flange is something that sits on the inside of the lip of the pot, the rim of the pot. So here's where my calipers come in. With the lid to the rim of the pot, I want to use the caliper, and this is a nice versatile tool, okay? You can use it a couple of different ways. When I'm measuring for the inside, I like to use this back end, okay, where I've got the tips kind of pointing out, and then when I measure that rim on the piece of clay that I'm going to work with, I like to use this because it tells me the outside diameter. So here I'm going to use my caliper, and I'm going to measure that inside. Okay, let's get that back in here so you can see it. I'm using my caliper, and I'm going to measure that inside diameter, and I want that to fit pretty close. So that's the approximate, that's the width that I'm going to set and make my flange. So I'm going to set that back aside, and I'm concerned right now with the inside diameter of the flange, of what's going to fit inside that pot. Okay, and then as I come back and as I make my lid, then I'm going to make a little rim that sits over it. Now, for this piece as well, I'm going to leave the bottom a little bit thicker so that I can I'll be able to trim a knob out as far as the handle for the lid goes. Alright, so again, I'm making sure that I have that stuck securely. Downward pressure. So, cone it up a couple times. So again, coning and centering, we're back to full speed. Makes your clay more uniform, more even throughout. Up one more time. As you work the clay, as you cone and center, you get a feeling for the uniformity of the clay. And because I commonly use recycled clay here at the wheel, clay that's been run through the pug mill, that was scrap clay that I recycled. And because it's run through the pug mill, sometimes there are some unique characteristics. It's not identical, if you will, to a piece of fresh clay that comes right out of the bag from the manufacturer. So it becomes very important for me as a potter using pug clay that I'm familiar with the unique characteristics of that clay. And thus, as I cone and center, I'm making that a much more uniform piece of clay. making sure that there aren't any air pockets or anything like that in it. Now, because I've got a lid that I want to be relatively wide, okay, and with a flange, what I want to have to this lid is a slight curvature to it. So kind of like, basically what I'm going to make here is I'm going to make a bowl. So I'm making a lid upside down. It's going to look like a bowl to start with. But then when I get to the rim, I'm going to leave a flange on that rim so that the flange sits on the inside and there's a little bit of a width of the lid that sits over the rim of the pot. So I've got that centered in a manner that I can work with. I'm going to now slow that down and again use my needle tool and make a target. A little water on there. Start to hold that out. And remember I said I'm going to leave that bottom a little bit thicker. So instead of going down to 1/2 inch, I want to be able to trim that out so that I actually have a knob on this pot. So instead of 1/2 inch, I'm leaving that a little bit thicker, like 3/4 inch. And I'm going to leave that thickness all the way so that I can trim a little knob out of there. So now with that 3/4 inch thickness, I'm going to start moving clay to the outside. And I've detected that I have a little bit of an issue there with this piece of clay. So I'm going to see what I can do to dig that out of there. A little bit of a hard spot. Okay, I'll go back to work. You want to make sure that your clay is as even as possible when you are working. So that'll work. Okay, so as I kind of set myself up for that lid, I have to keep in mind that I'm going to make a flange. I need to pull this up. I need to leave my wall a little thicker. So as I start with everything, I made a little groove. I lift and pull. I go back and compress the rim. Oh, no, what I forgot to do was compress the bottom. So let's go back and do that before I get too far along. I want to go back and compress the bottom. Now keep in mind that's going to be the bottom side of my lid, so it's not as critical there. Okay, in that respect. It's not the bottom of the pot, but it's now the bottom of the lid. So I need to leave a little bit more clay at the rim, so I'm compressing that down a little bit thicker so that I have room to make a flange when that time comes. The lid, what's a good idea with a lid too is to leave it in and of itself a little bit thicker. It's got to be a durable piece of pottery because you're going to be lifting that lid on and off the pot and setting it down, so you want to make sure that it's thick enough to be strong enough for your purpose. You don't want to have a lid that might be too thin and subsequently be pretty fragile. So I'm going to even that out a little bit more there. And I'm pulling a little bit more thickness into my rim, starting to open it to an outward shape a little bit. Alright, so I have that little bit of added thickness, and I'll be able to make my flange out of that pretty easily. Remember, I left the bottom of this a little bit thicker so that I'll be able to trim a knob, a little handle for the pot. So, now if you recall, this particular space that I have with my caliper, let's bring my candy dish back. That's the space that I need. So as I measure for the outside, I have a little bit wider to go to make my flange. So you can see I'm not too far off in my shape. So as I stretch this out a little bit, as I use a sponge, or I can even use my rib, okay, using the rib will give me a nice clean inside edge. A little bit of pressure. Be sure to, once you get where you want, relax and then release. The faster you move, the more apt you are to do something that you didn't intend to do. So there, I've moved that out a little bit. I still have a little bit farther to go. Let's see how the sponge is going to do here. So I still need to stretch this out a little bit more. And you can see that the lid is taking on some shape. And there we have kind of an inside diameter for that flange. So if I take very simply now, I'm going to use one of my trimming tools here. And as I have that inside diameter set for my caliper, I know where my flange has to be. That fits to the inside. So I want to make sure that now what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate a little bit of clay here. The clay that I'm pushing down, I'm now creating the rim of the lid that's going to overhang my pot. And I can see here that now what I've made is this little bit of a lip that is the flange. And there, that fits to the diameter that I desire. I could make that, if I wanted, a little bit deeper so that the flange sits a little bit farther down inside. You have to be careful here that you're not altering your rim too much. Clean up your rim so it's nice. You have to be careful with tools. Tools can be very valuable, but they can also cause you some problems. You want to make sure that the clay doesn't get a hold of the tool and do something that you didn't want to have done. So here, as I kind of clean that up a little bit, take a look at that. That's just a little something, that a little extra clay there, just loose clay, and you can see how I'm just kind of gently scraping that off. Alright, I'm going to check my caliper, and I can see that now I've pushed that in a little bit. It's a little too narrow. Now I want to make that a little bit wider, and that's an easy fix here with my sponge. Notice my wheel speed is relatively slow. I don't want to get carried away and move too fast. Because I'm contacting at one point, whatever I do is, because I move slowly, whatever I do at that one point is happening to the entire pot. So I've opened that up a little bit, and there I have my flange back at the diameter that I desire. I'm going to stop the wheel and take a look at my lid and see if it's a shape that I like. And it kind of does a nice job of echoing the shape of my pot, of my dish. So, and I've left clay there where I can create the knob. So I'll be able to do that in another portion or in another video. But for right now, I can see that if I brought my pot back and I were to turn my lid over, I can see that my lid and my pot sit together nicely. Whoop. I have to be cautious not to let that sit on there too much because of the weight of the clay. I don't want to alter anything. So I'm going to make sure that my dish did not get altered in that process. My dish still looks pretty good. Let's set that aside once again. You want to make sure with any lidded vessel that before you commit the lid to the pot, that you let them sit and dry together, in other words, that you have everything where you kind of want it to be. You don't want too much weight, you don't want the clay too soft, or you're going to find that the weight of one piece is going to cause undue pressure on the other piece. So make sure that my flange is where I want it there, and that measures up again there. So that in and of itself is all good. So now I've just made, and I'm going to go ahead and trim out a little bit down here at the bottom. Not much, because I'm going to come back and trim that later on and form the knob. Alright, here we are. I've trimmed that out and got rid of some of the loose clay. So now I have a lid and a pot that will go together. Later on I'll put a knob, do the finishing touches, and I'll put a knob on that pot, on that lid. So there we are. We have a lid and a pot. So there's a candy dish, a lidded jar. Thanks for watching.